Hi. Super Gemini is UDO's flagship synth, and along with Super 8, is a member of the second generation of its synths. Specifically for Gemini, while its 2 rows of timbre controls and ribbon are its most apparent new features, there's also quite a lot that's new under the hood, though some features removed compared to the Super 6. And while its layout is clearly inspired by Yamaha's CS80 and Roland's vintage synths, it's not a clone in any way. Like its siblings in UDO's synth range, it's got modern digital oscillators with customizable wave shapes, analog filters and VCAs, an interesting stereo mode UDO calls Binaural, a large set of mod destinations and audio rate cross mods, an arpeggiator, sequencer, and more. In this video, I'll take a look at Super Gemini and how it compares to the rest of UDO's synth lineup, discuss the pros and cons of this line of synths overall compared to its competition, and play you plenty of its bitimbral presets. If you're on my Patreon, I'll also load quite a few multi-samples of it so you can get a taste of playing it at home. Before I start, a quick disclosure: UDO sent me Super Gemini. It cost me in customs, fees, and taxes, but still significantly less than retail. Other than that, no money changed hands, they have no say over the content of this video, and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, I'll start by zooming out to UDO's entire synth range. Very broadly speaking, there are 2 generations of UDO synths. The first generation, Super 6 and Super 6 Desktop, and then the second generation, Super 8 and Super Gemini. The main differences between the 2 generations are, first, Super 8 and Gemini are bitimbral synths, meaning you can play 2 sounds at a time, in a split, or in a layer. So this is sound 1, and this is sound 2, and together they do this, as opposed to one single preset at a time on the previous Super 6 generation. You can load patches into either layer and then save the combination of both layers in one of 128 different performances. The different layers can also run different sequences or different arpeggios at different rates. So for example, the upper note is an arp at one rate, and the bottom 2 notes are running at a different rate. Or even different patterns if you like. Then beyond bitimbrality, there's not one main thing, but rather a slew of little improvements here and there, where each on their own isn't a game changer, but they really add up together. I'll cover all of these during the video. One worth mentioning though up front is the ability to morph between 2 waveforms on DDS1, including between 2 single cycle waveforms, 32 of which are provided, and you can load up your own as well. By the way, some features have been redacted in this generation compared to the Super 6. Most notably, there's no audio input for processing external audio through DDS2, and at least for now, the feature where you could run LFO1 at audio rates and assign any one of Oscillator 1 or DDS1's waveforms to it has been redacted. For now at least, it's only sine waves at audio rate. Then the next big difference, the second generation of UDO synths has additional voices, 16 voices in Super 8 and 20 in Super Gemini, compared to 12 voices on the first gen Super 6 models. Both generations support UDO's binaural mode, in which case you have half the voices. So 6 on Super 6, 8 on Super 8, and 10 on Super Gemini. Then on the new generation, the Keybed has polyphonic aftertouch, meaning pressure is detected on a per key basis. compared to mono aftertouch keys on the Super 6. It should be noted, however, in what is a first ever offer to my knowledge by a synth company, UDO is offering a paid upgrade to Super 6's Keybed so you can swap it with a poly aftertouch keybed. This is a procedure you need to perform on your own. I upgraded my old Super 6. It took about 45 minutes. It doesn't require any soldering, just removing and inserting screws and ribbon cables and the ability to carefully follow instructions. And while I can't say that I wasn't a bit nervous about it, it's way easier and takes less time than building a typical IKEA cabinet. The new poly aftertouch keybed on this generation of synths and on Super 6 if you upgraded feels great in my opinion. There's good travel across the range of keys, though travel distance until the aftertouch point is a little shallow compared to some other keybeds, about 8mm on the edge here compared to 10mm on some keybeds. Aftertouch control I think is fairly precise and has a travel distance of about 5mm for the white keys and about 2mm for the black keys. Velocity sensitivity also is very good, but there's no way to customize velocity or aftertouch curves. Then focusing on just the second generation of synths, the main differences between Super 8 and Super Gemini is that Super 8 has a single row of controls for both timbres, as opposed to 2 on Super Gemini, and Super 8 doesn't have this ribbon controller, though UDO is offering the ribbon controller as an add-on, and layer detuning gets a dedicated knob, as opposed to a shift function on Super 8. You control the two layers on Super 8 by toggling between them using the layer button. Other than that, the two should sound and be identical, except for the price, of course. Speaking of the ribbon, by default it acts as a pitch bend, going 2 octaves down on the way down and 1 octave on the way up. You can use it to perform gentle pitch bends, vibratos, and even trills. Unlike the bender or a regular pitch wheel, it doesn't bounce back when you leave your finger. And it has an interesting feature where if you hold a chord either with a sustain pedal or using this button, then it won't impact the held notes, only notes you're holding as you slide your finger across the ribbon. If you like, you can also use the mod matrix to assign the ribbon to any destination. In that case, the ribbon no longer controls the pitch of the oscillators. So that's it for a bird's eye view of what's new in this generation of synths. I'll dive into the details of what's new in a bit, but for those of you not familiar with this line of synths at all, generally speaking, the top row or top 2 rows in the case of Super Gemini have the sound shaping controls, 1 per timbre in this case. Below that is a control row, which includes the arpeggiator, sequencer, various play modes, and buttons that serve both for patch storage and as a mod matrix. The left-hand controller section lets you control the bender, aftertouch, and LFO2 routings. Per voice, these synths have 2 LFOs, where LFO1 can also be used as an envelope or a high-speed sine wave oscillator. Then you've got 2 digital main oscillators here, again per voice, called DDS, one which supports single-cycle waveforms and has a super mode, as in Supersaw or Unison, but it supports that for all of its different waveforms. Then there's a simpler oscillator that can also be used as an LFO and sub-oscillator. Further down the chain is a mixer to mix between DDS1 and DDS2, a 6 dB per octave high-pass filter, 24 dB per octave resonant low-pass filter, 2 envelopes, one of which can be set to loop, and then each timbre has its own chorus settings and its own delay settings with a delay send per timbre. In terms of patch or preset storage, in Super 6 you can store 128 patches in 16 banks, A through H, and A2 when this blinks through H2, and you've got 8 patches per bank. On Super 8 and Super Gemini, you've got double the patches, so all this happens in 2 main banks, A and B. And then on top of that, you can store 128 performances, which are combinations of two patches. And the dual performance patches are stored separately from the individual 256 patches, which is a good thing. So significantly more storage on this generation of synths. In terms of connectivity, Super 8 and Super Gemini have a headphone jack under here up front where it should be, unlike Super 6 where it's in the back. And then besides that, they've got stereo 1/4-inch outputs, main outputs, which contains a mix of both timbres. Then besides the regular stereo mix outputs, the new generation of synths have two additional pairs, a stereo pair for each of the layers in the synth. So effectively Super 8 and Super Gemini are quadraphonic synths. All outputs are unbalanced, unfortunately. Then across the series of synths, you've got USB Type B for MIDI, patch access, and firmware updates, 5-pin MIDI in, out, and through. Super 6 has 2 pedal jacks, sustain and expression. Super 8 and Super Gemini have 4 pedal jacks, 2 continuous controller jacks, one for expression and another for volume. Then 2 more jacks, one for sustain and one for freezing the delay buffer. I'll show you that in a bit. And the sustain and delay freeze jacks are TRS jacks, meaning that if you've got one of those pedals that have dual foot switches, or if you've got a single foot switch controller that lets you choose between the left and right foot switch, then you can selectively hold or freeze the buffer in either of the timbres. And then an advantage Super 6 has over this generation, like I mentioned earlier, it's got an external audio input. That audio can be routed into DDS2 and also be used to trigger the envelopes. The external input option has been replaced here on the panel with a sub-oscillator, a new sub-oscillator shape, so you can now choose either square or sine. Then continuing with the overview, there's no screen on these synths, so they're pretty much fader and knob per function, except for shift functions written in inverted text. You edit these by holding shift and moving the parameter, or pressing shift and moving the fader to access the shift function. And then modulation workflow has sort of 3 tiers. The first, direct faders and knobs on the panel. So for example, to route LFO1 to the pitch of DDS2, just do this. Very similar to classic Roland synths. And then you can create additional mod connections using the matrix, which has a bit of hidden functionality. More on that later. All UDO synths have a few stereo features. Most prominent is the binaural mode. This goes beyond stereo panning and lets you phase offset LFO1 as a mod source for creating an interesting stereo effect when pointed at various destinations LFO1 can be linked to on the panel. So for example, I'll start with an init preset, take a sawtooth and filter it out a bit with the resonance. So if I point LFO1 to the filter, by default you won't hear the binaural or stereo effect. But if I start moving this fader, which represents the left-right phase of LFO1, you'll start hearing stereo filtering. And that's because what binaural does is allocate 2 voices per note, hard-panned left and right, receiving different stages in LFO1's cycle. So this is fantastic. The disadvantage of binaural mode is that it cuts your voice count in half because each note needs 2 voices. Besides the filter cutoff, you've got binaural modulation of the VCAs, kind of like binaural tremolo, of pulse width, and wave morph. I'll explain that later. And if you want, of pitch, you can go wild or have subtle binaural vibrato. Binaural, by the way, isn't the only stereo option on the synth. If you don't want to have your voice count, you can turn it off, and then this fader will alternate between left and right on each subsequent note. Another interesting stereo effect is the super function, Super DDS. More on this in a bit. There's a little thump, by the way, as you move from mono to stereo. So just be mindful of that. The delay, by the way, isn't a ping pong delay, but if you send stereo audio to it, then you can get a stereo effect. The chorus is in stereo as well. And you can also pan both timbres Okay, let's take a look at some more details. I think one of the biggest improvements in the synth engine of this second generation of synths is in DDS1. So previously you could choose between one of 6 shapes: sine, saw, square, triangle, noise, which is a bit more subtle here and filtered, and single cycle waveform, where you could choose one of 32 different waveforms using these keys here on the right. There are 16 of these buttons or keys, so you need to tap again to reach the second waveform for a total of 32 waveforms. Now, in this new generation, as is hinted in the arrows around the selector, each of these waveforms can morph into the one next to it. So sine into saw, saw into square, square into triangle, triangle into the subtle noise, and subtle noise into whatever the waveform I chose for this slot is. And then if you choose the waveform slot, then you can morph between 2 waveforms, waveform A and B as selected here. So this would be A, for example. Let's go for this one for A. And then B would be, we won't hear it until we morph into it, this one. So I wouldn't go ahead and call this a wavetable synth, because most modern ones have 32, 64, or even more frames or waveforms in a wavetable, but 2 frames is certainly better than none, and I think considerably opens up this synth. Besides that, DDS1 still has the same super, sister, or unison oscillator functionality. So if we take any of its waveforms and turn on super or super DDS to half or on, you'd get 6 copies playing in unison with the main oscillator with increased detune. And this, of course, works while we're morphing the waveform, or any of the regular waveforms, including saw. What you lose in DDS1 compared to Super 6 is the SWM functionality, because this fader now controls the waveform morphing. SWM would add an addition layer of modulation for the sister oscillators. It was nice to have, but I think wave transformation is a dramatically better feature. So that's the core of DDS1. Let's move to DDS2. It's a simpler oscillator, whereas DDS1 only has coarse tuning. DDS2 has fine tuning relative to DDS1. It has octave controls as well, and an LFO mode where you can use it as a mod source, and then independently of its rate, you also get a bonus square or sine sub oscillator. Shapes for DDS2 are sine, saw, square, triangle, a more prominent noise, and variable pulse width, with pulse width modulation, of course. In terms of oscillator cross mods, you've got FM cross mod from DDS2 into DDS1. As per Super 6, the cross-mod option takes a triangle waveform, regardless of what this is set to, from DDS1 and modulates the frequency of DDS2 with it. Now it's in LFO mode, but it can go to higher rates. So nice harmonic craziness to be had there. So same deal there, and same goes for sync for DDS2, works the same way as previously. One interesting fact about oscillator sync, as you know what makes this sound, where oscillator 2 slaves to oscillator 1. Anyway, if you turn oscillator sync on, then cross-mod now routes DDS1 to DDS2. So don't be surprised if you've got sync on, turn on DDS1, and nothing happens. Cross-mod has been inverted, and DDS1's shape doesn't seem to matter in this cross-mod either. And then new for cross-mods, now we've got a new ring mod option, where DDS1 and DDS2 are multiplied and you hear the result in DDS2. So depending on the frequency ratio between the oscillators, this can be either subtle or not. And the waveform of both oscillators matters. I think these audio rate sweet spots are a big part of what makes this synth's charm and ability to surprise. And as this label implies, cross-mod is relevant for ring mod too. So this opens up Super 8 and Gemini to even more hard, interesting, and metallic sounds. Now, eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that the ring mod replaces the X-fade option. Previously, you could set it that DDS1 would play on half of the keyboard and DDS2 would play on the other half, and you could set the split point between those two halves with a crossfade in the middle to get a kind of paraphonic bitimbral split mode. That feature has been removed in favor of ring mod, presumably because Super 8 and Super Gemini are fully bitimbral synths, as opposed to just using split oscillators. Let's init this preset and move on. I mentioned this earlier, besides the two oscillators, LFO1 can be used as an additional oscillator, either not tracking the keyboard or tracking the keyboard. In this case, we only get a sine wave, and you can choose to mix that into DDS1 or DDS2 because the mixer can only mix between DDS1 and DDS2. So this is DDS1, this is DDS2. Let's maybe use a triangle here. And if we bring in LFO1 alongside DDS1, we can tune it at a fixed rate or have it track the keyboard. So now it's mixed in with DDS1, or we can have it mixed in with DDS2. And like I mentioned, it's just a sine wave, at least for now. In Super 6, you can borrow any one of DDS1's wave shapes and assign them to LFO1. Hopefully we get that in a firmware update, but there's no indication that that's going to happen. Okay, let's move on to the filter section. This is almost identical to Super 6, except that now you've got a fader for the high-pass filter. There's no direct key tracking option for the high-pass filter, but you can assign note to it using the mod matrix. This is a 6 dB per octave high-pass filter, and then we've got a 24 dB per octave low-pass filter without resonance. When drive is off, increasing resonance will reduce bass levels. And the filter will self-oscillate if you want. If we set drive to 1, you almost can't notice any saturation. However, this mode does have bass compensation, so as you increase resonance, there's hardly any drop in bass levels. Resonance does get a bit crunchier. And then when you set drive to 2, you can definitely notice both saturation and a crunchier, yet not as loud resonance. Like I mentioned, resonance will self-oscillate in any of the modes. And there's key tracking, either half or one. Not precise tracking though, even after calibration. Okay, let's move on to the VCA section. A nice addition here compared to Super 6 is a dedicated fader for DDS2 modulation of the VCA. So this is our core sound, and basically amplitude modulation, and DDS2's frequency matters. Again, a nice opportunity for audio rate craziness. Seems like it uses the same shape except for noise. But it's good to see noise as a source here as well. By the way, in Super 6, you can modulate VCA level by pointing DDS2 to the envelope level in the mod matrix, but it doesn't quite sound the same. So yet another way to get bell-like tones from this synth. The VCA section also has increased relevancy within the context of Super 8 and Super Gemini, because that's where you set the relative levels between the two timbres. The VCA also has a handy dynamics section, which lets you introduce velocity sensitivity, either half or full, both to the filter and the VCA. So that's it for the VCA section. Then we've got the effects section with chorus 1, nice chorus, chorus 2, or both, and a delay, which, like I mentioned earlier, needs ascend and has time controls, and feedback. And like on Super 6, the delay has a hidden freeze or micro looping feature, which if you plug a sustain pedal in the back or self-promotion alert, a +3, which UDO have conveniently left a place for on the panel. But again, you can use a sustain pedal too. Anyway, what freeze lets you do is basically freeze the buffer, either by just holding a sustain pedal or locking in this micro loop. And once you do that, you can play on top of this sustain texture or swap it if you like. Then play on top of that, play another chord, swap the buffer out again, and swap the buffer out again. And when you want this to stop, just release your foot off the pedal and it'll die down based on the feedback. Okay, let's move on and talk about modulation. Super 8 and Gemini, like Super 6, have plenty of direct hands-on panel controls connecting various mod sources to mod destinations without ever diving into the matrix. So for example, binaural mod depth, pitch mod depth to these destinations from LFO1 or envelope 1, DDS1 wave and DDS2 pulse width modulation, again from LFO1 and envelope 1, cross mods, plenty of mod sources for the filter cutoff, mod sources for the VCA. The left-hand controller is another whole set of on-panel mod depth controls. The arrows kind of explain it, so the left-right bender connects to either pitch of the oscillators, 1, 2, or both, and timbres, or to the filter, or both. And then LFO2 is kind of wonky. As you can see by this LED, it's not on right now. It's not doing anything unless I trigger it by moving this forward. And of course I need to set a mod depth to something, so let's say to the filter. And then this switch will control whether just the bender triggers the LFO or whether both the bender and aftertouch. Trigger LFO2, get it going. You can also have aftertouch and the bender control LFO2's rate. And LFO2 can just be on if you like, if you don't want to worry about the bender or aftertouch. Anyway, the whole point is that there are plenty of mod sources and destinations without ever touching the matrix. In terms of on-panel mod sources, there are a few differences between this generation and Super 6. LFO2 now has multiple shapes, not just triangle. LFO1 is identical. It can be either reset with each key press or run once, so basically be used as an envelope. LFO1 can also tempo sync if you turn sync on. And then the envelopes are the same. Envelope 1 can loop. Envelope 2 can be connected either to the VCA or the filter, not anything else. I think it's not a source on the matrix. Envelope 1, though, is a source on the matrix. And compared to Super 6, Envelope 1 lost a fader. You don't have a dedicated hold fader. It's now a shift function. So beyond the modulation options on the panel, all UDO synths have a mod matrix with 8 sources on the panel and 8 destinations on the panel, as well as the option to map sources to different controls on the panel, not all of them, but most of them. Some sources and destinations have changed in this generation of synths. On the source side, bender minus and plus have been removed, and instead you've got the ribbon and note on Super Gemini, or bender and note on Super 8. On the destination side, 3 destinations have been swapped out, but it doesn't mean you can't access those destinations. A quick recap on how the mod matrix works on UDO synths. First, you need to go into mod assign, and then choose a source, let's say aftertouch, and point that somewhere on the matrix, let's say. So say to wave, and once you make that connection, you set a mod depth. And these LEDs will show you whether it's a negative mod depth or positive mod depth. Let's just go all the way. And we've now connected aftertouch to the wave control. It's also connected to vibrato, as you notice here. I can disable that with this switch if I want. If you want to connect to a destination that isn't available on the matrix, like low-pass filter, to do that you hold the source and then wiggle the destination, and if you wiggled a destination you can assign to, you'll see these lights animate briefly, and then again set a positive or negative mod depth. And now aftertouch controls both wave and the filter. If you're doing other things and want to get back to the matrix and know what's going on, you can get an idea of which sources and destinations are active because they'll blink when you press this button. If you press a destination, you'll see which sources control it. If you press a source, you'll see the on-matrix destinations light up, but there's no way, unfortunately, at least not currently, to know that aftertouch is also connected to the low-pass filter. You can sort of get an idea of what's going on if a source isn't connected to an on-matrix destination. So for example, let's say that I wanted to connect expression to, let's say, the envelope level and assign a mod depth. So now if I get back to the matrix, you'll notice expression is blinking, and if I press this, none of the destination LEDs are on. That means that expression is pointing somewhere, but again, there's no way currently to know what that is unless you remember that it's VCA envelope level in this case. Another important thing to be aware of, at least as of the current firmware, let's say that I wanted to map expression to a destination on a different layer than the one I'm working on. You can't do that currently. So if I hold expression and wiggle this fader, I got confirmation that an assignment was going to be made, but it actually assigns that to the filter in the current layer, not the one that I touched. That's something hopefully they can fix. For now, if you want expression to control both filters, you'd need to move into that layer, hit mod assign, and then map expression to the fader in that layer as well. Moving on, the arpeggiator and sequencer are very similar to Super 6. On the arpeggiator side, the biggest improvement is that you now have a dedicated clock division knob. I mentioned this earlier, it's particularly useful when you use different clock division rates on a per timbre basis. So for example, triplets are what's on the upper layer, and the lower layer has a non-triplet clock division, and the result is this interesting polyrhythmic arpeggiation. The other arpeggiator options can also be different. So for example, on the lower layer, I'm going through 3 octaves, whereas on the upper layer, it's just 1 octave, and we can change pattern playback as well. And the sequencer is just like on Super 6, except for one redacted feature. You actually can't play on top of the sequencer in the current layer in Super 8 and Super Gemini. Besides that, the sequencer works exactly the same way. You've got 5 tracks, a step track, slide option, accent, rests, and the overall sequencer length. Sequence can be up to 64 steps long. And you can't play live into a sequence, only step sequence into it. It works the same way as in Super 6. You choose the step you want to start at, play a pattern, and you've got a sequence. And you can then edit the length if you wanted. And I can transpose the sequence if I remember to get out of step recording mode. So you can transpose sequences, you just can't play on top of them unless you use 2 layers. Besides these tracks, there's no automation, there's no micro timing, but you can create polyphonic sequences. You can store and recall 16 different patterns. And swap patterns, but it won't wait for a pattern to finish. So you've got to time it right. It would be nice if there was an option to complete a sequence before moving on to the next one. So those are the big or little differences scattered throughout the synth between Super Gemini, Super 8, and Super 6. Let's briefly go over what is the same across all UDO synths. Drift is a nice feature, so there's this dual layer sound, and then if I hold shift and start increasing drift, like the vintage feature on sequential synths, there's increasing randomization of various parameters. Then there's a unison option with a few unison size options. That's a shift feature here. This is voice unison, by the way, unlike the oscillator unison or sister oscillators for DDS1. By the way, this is unison of just one oscillator. I could add DDS2 or maybe even put DDS1 in a super mode. And that's just one layer. If you're a Unison fan, there's plenty of it to go around here. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for Super Gemini. On the cons side, Super Gemini and Super 8 aren't cheap and don't tick all the synth boxes. You can get less expensive synths with more features. Not so much more hands-on controls, I think, by the way, but you will find other synths with, say, full wavetable support, more effects, more modulation options, cheaper if you don't insist on analog filters and FPGA oscillators, and a screen which, while I get the minimalist aesthetic, is useful sometimes to see things like preset names or complex modulation routings, things which are noticeably obscured here. Also, while 20 voices sounds like a lot if you want both binaural, which is excellent, and dual layers, which is the point of this synth, each of these cuts the voice count down in half. So if you want to use this synth to its full binaural and multi-timbral potential, you're down to effectively 5 voices, and voice stealing is noticeable in that mode, especially when playing the lush evolving timbres it can create. Then on the firmware or wishlist side, and to be clear, these are my requests, not a confirmed roadmap, I'd love to see LFO1 as a mod source in the matrix, because it's the source of what makes binaural modulation work. It would be great to point that to more destinations than just what LFO1 can be pointed to on the panel. And then personally, I'd love to see a mode where the marks on the ribbon actually represent semitones. Right now, since it modulates differently going up than going down, and even going in one direction, it's hard to judge what you're pitching up or down into to hit specific notes, which I think is a missed opportunity. No need to look far. The way it's implemented on Hydrasynth works really well. And then my final wish list would be to see features that already exist in Super 6 find their way here, in particular more than just sine wave support for the high frequency tracked LFO1 and MPE, which currently doesn't exist, but obviously because it's on the panel, I guess it's safe to assume at some point that would come. So those are the cons. On the pros side, probably the most important thing you can say about a synth, Super Gemini in particular, is just a treat to spend time with. While subjective, obviously in my opinion, it sounds good, otherwise what would be the point? But then beside that, it's truly an instrument to go on journeys with. Because of the way its hands-on controls invite you to play, there's so much to explore here, and the fact that everything is just laid out before you makes a significant difference compared to other synths where you need to page between parameter lists or menus or swap modes. And then don't let the fact that this looks like a Juno or CS80 fool you. Super Gemini has a very broad range of timbres under its belt. The combination of morphing between custom waveforms and so many different easily available mod connections, many of which invite you to explore audio rate madness, like the cross mod, the ring mod, the cross mod and sync, DDS2 into the VCA. Each one of these has so many timbral nooks and crannies and in between sweet spots. I literally spent many full days playing with Super Gemini, and it felt like I only scratched the surface of where it can go. And then a thought about Super 8 versus Super Gemini. While they can both play the same sounds, if you want to work with and edit bitimbral patches, which I think is the whole point of getting a bitimbral synth in the first place, it means that on Super 8, pretty much all the time, the faders will be in the wrong position as you move between the lower and upper layers. That means you can't see what's going on and parameters will jump. The price difference between the two isn't that large. If you can afford a Super 8, you can probably also afford a Super Gemini. Plus you get more voices, which is particularly important, like I mentioned earlier, if you use either binaural or dual/split, or definitely both. So that's it for Super Gemini. Stay tuned for me playing dozens of its presets, and you'll find plenty of multi-samples of its sounds on my Patreon to try it at home, where you'll also find my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.